everyone. Welcome back to the Grow RDH podcast. My name is Katie and I'm your host for today. And I'm back outside. If you are watching on YouTube, you can see, but it is nice out again today. So I am taking advantage of the deck and it's gorgeous out. So you may hear some birds chirping in the background, but it's wonderful here. I know that some of the country is having a heat wave like crazy, but are not. We're like mid 80s right now and it's absolutely gorgeous. So I had to take advantage of the outside beautiful weather. So if you are a new listener, welcome. Thank you for being here. Today we're talking about obesity, and this is a follow-up episode to episode 19. So if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to episode 19, then come back and listen to today's because it will make way more sense. We are going to be talking about how to have a conversation with a patient surrounding obesity. And what we did last week was we really solidified the link between obesity and how it relates to periodontitis and any of the periodontal maintenance efforts that we're making with our patients, right? And so I sort of prefaced this last week, but it's time to sort of transition into, okay, how do we discuss those things with the patient? Because weight is a very sensitive topic, right? And that conversation just in general is deeply personal. And anytime we have to address personal issues, we have to, one, establish trust first. And then two, we have to approach it with empathy. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so we're going to kind of break this up in a few sections here. One, I'm just going to cover some BMI basics. And then two, we're going to talk about maybe some tips and tricks of how to approach these patients. And three, we're just going to summarize with some clinical takeaways of how this might impact or how you could incorporate this into your practice. So first, a few BMI basics, right? BMI calculation is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. So we have to do some conversions there. But what we're looking for is an objective number, right? And so underweight BMIs are anything less than 18.5. Normal BMIs are anywhere from 18.5 to 24.9. Overweight BMIs are 25 to 29.9. And then obesity range of BMI is anything over 30. And so BMI is a measurement, right? It's a screening tool, but it is useful, but it's not comprehensive, if that makes sense. A lot of people, they hear the word BMI and they're just completely turned off because you miss a lot of information in a BMI. And there's other measurements that you can do for body composition, and that's great. And so people like athletes with really high muscle mass, that BMI probably is going to be a little bit skewed. Maybe some older adults or adults with higher body fat, again, that's going to be a little bit skewed. And so there may need to be more conversations for individual patients that we have that show that BMI isn't the end all be all number that we're looking for. But for the general patient, it's useful for us, right? Because it helps us objectify or quantify weight in a way that is a little bit more approachable to a patient. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But I wanted to share a current lit review. This lit review was published in February of 2024, so of this year. And I was shocked by this number. This lit review is great, and it talks about how dental providers incorporate weight screenings into their practice. But this number, 29% of dental offices are already screening for height and weight, which is amazing. I was shocked at that number. I thought it would have been less because in my area, in the areas where I've worked clinically or subbed or just no other hygienists, that number is 0. There's none that I know of in my local area. But doesn't mean it's not happening. And according to this lit review, 29%, that's awesome. So I think that's a huge number. And I think that's just promising data that shows obesity conversations are trending and it's becoming more common, and dental practitioners are more aware of the link, and so they're having those conversations a little more often. So I think that's awesome. So I wanted to share that information, and I will link that article. It is an open access article, and so I will link that in the description so you can check it out for yourself. So next we're going to sort of transition into communication tips. How does this look? How do we discuss obesity with patients? And I just want to first off preface by reassuring our patients that this isn't just, a number on a scale, and that we understand it's a deeply personal issue. Patients could feel judged. They could feel embarrassed, and inherently that makes this conversation a little bit more difficult. But I think, this is a personal opinion, just dealing with patients, I think objectively the numbers on the scale are more objective than me just looking at somebody and assuming their weight or height or their body composition just based on looks alone or whatever it is, they're in their chair. And so this can often be sort of intertwined with emotions, with self-esteem, awareness, and even social stigma. So I think it's important to just, first off, from the jump, handle it with care. We want to use objective language. And so BMI is objective, right? BMI is a number. And so another tip is that we can avoid using language that is maybe more accusatory or judgmental. If we're just talking about numbers, if we're taking their height, taking their weight, coming up with the BMI calculation, we can use the number instead of saying, I think you're overweight. What is your weight management plans, or what is your weight management ideas? So if we use the BMI will help us quantify those differences in a consistent way. And if it's consistent in that we take height and weight on every single patient that comes here, then they don't feel targeted. They don't feel like, oh, well, she must think I look overweight. And that's really important too, to be consistent. Taking height and weight on everybody avoids that sort of sense of judgment or targeting. Objective measures provide a clear and standardized to assess and monitor a patient's weight and health. It removes bias, right? If you are using that objective measurement, again, you're not targeting, you're not judging, you are simply, there's no bias in that. These are the numbers and this is what the numbers show. And going back to the first part of this conversation, while BMIs are not foolproof, they are not perfect. They are just a starting point, and it's a way to start that conversation and maybe go from there, or maybe recommend some body composition measurements outside of BMI if you feel that that patient falls into maybe a category of not what their BMI is saying, if that makes sense. We're healthcare providers and we use our clinical judgment, right? We know that, and we can sort of use that and guide our decisions around talking about weight. Next tip is to shift the conversation then from numbers, so you've presented the numbers, to overall health. And I'm just going to keep talking about this, but we are providers of overall well-being, and discussing weight management can improve a lot of things in someone's life that struggles with weight management. We talked about all those details last week, but just to review, chronic inflammation is highly linked to obesity, and supporting that patient in sort of coming up with goals about reducing the risk of that chronic inflammation, and thus by doing that, reducing the risk of chronic diseases, that enhances their well-being overall. This impacts many different aspects of their overall well-being. And I think once we've presented the numbers, and then we've presented the way that interacts with our overall health, I think patients are going to be much more understanding and aware of where we're coming from, right? They perceive it to be more from a place of, oh, they're looking to sort of help me. They're not judging me. They're not targeting me. They just they're concerned for my overall health. And I think that goes a long way in building trust. Next tip is to avoid terms that make people feel judged. One of these things, this is tricky when we're doing our role plays in school with some of the students, right? So this is kind of a little contradictory, right? But I think we can handle this with a little bit of discernment. If we use BMI numbers, we can just use the number, but that number is tied to the term overweight and obese, right? We know that over 30 is obese, and then in that range below is overweight. And so there are some categories there that use that terminology, but we don't have to use that terminology. We know that anybody above that is in that sort of danger zone. So we can just use the numbers alone if we perceive that the patient is really triggered by using the words overweight and obese. And I don't want to say that we should withhold information from them, right? We don't want to not tell them the truth, but I think it's important to just proceed with caution and use the numbers if you don't feel comfortable saying overweight or obese. And if they ask you what the numbers mean, you can put it in terms of anything above this specific number puts you at an increased risk for chronic inflammation, puts you at an increased risk. So that's how we use that scale. And I think, again, it allows us to present the information without using those trigger terms like overweight and obese. Now, if you're perceiving that they're very open to this discussion or they use the terms themselves, go ahead and use the terms at your discretion and see how it goes. Another tip is to be collaborative about it. And this ties back to motivational interviewing. And remember, the first rule of motivational interviewing is that the patient is at the center of care. That's where we get the term patient-centered care. And part of that, we talk about, when we teach motivational interviewing, we talk about smoking a lot. That's an example we use a lot, because some patients are so against talking about smoking that that's the first thing they say when they come in. I don't want to talk. Please don't ask me about smoking. I'm a smoker. I'm going to smoke. And so obesity is another one where some patients just are really against talking about it. And even the thought of them getting their weight measured or taken at the dental office just doesn't make sense to them. They don't understand why. And so education, one, is important to educate patients on why we're doing everything we do. But then collaboration is our way of having the patient understand why we're doing something and getting on board. Collaborating is us pulling them on board so they understand, one, why we're doing it, and two, they take an active role in making the decisions behind what we're doing. Collaborative goal setting means that the patient is in the driver's seat and you're just helping them to guide them to the place or the decision that is in their best interest. That goes back to internal motivation, and through motivational interviewing training, you learn how to get people to verbalize their motivations or how to get people to discuss what their goals are in that type of setting, right? And so I can't stress enough, finding their internal motivation behind a health problem is really important. We have to ask the patient their primary concerns. What are their desires? What are their goals? How do they want to achieve health? What types of health goals are important to them? You can ask about their experiences with other providers. Say, if you ask them, is this something that you've been working with other healthcare providers, like your nurse or your doctor or a dietitian? If they say no, then great. You get to be the first one to sort of help educate them. And if they say yes, that means that they're already pretty aware of maybe some of the health issues that they're experiencing. And you can use that to your advantage and ask them, what have you been working on? Or what are some of the goals that you've already achieved? And I think that's great because, again, you're pulling that information out of them. You're allowing them the chance to share the things that they've done well. And so having supportive providers that they trust and working and collaborating with them is a great tool. If they don't, it would be a good idea for you as a provider to have some contacts, whether that be a nutritionist or a dietitian, whether that be a primary care provider in your area that maybe specializes in working with patients towards weight management goals. Having other providers that you trust, that you have a relationship with in terms of referring patients out or collaborating with them is a great way to sort of bridge that gap. And I think it looks good on your part too, because it gives the patient the perception that you've done this before and you've worked with other patients on weight management and you've had success. And so just dive in, maybe reach out to some contacts in your area of providers and start those conversations and maybe get some recommendations from them. As finally, make sure the topic remains on the table. This is another tactic of motivational interviewing that I love and that I still use with my smokers that do not want to talk about smoking. I always make sure before they leave that the conversation stays on the table. And it could be a simple question at the end, this is something that I really do want to monitor with you. And I understand you don't want to talk about it today, but would you mind in 3 or 6 months if I asked you about it again? And that just keeps the conversation open. It keeps the topic relevant, and it's something you can note in your documentation that this patient, you did bring it up, they did not want to discuss, and you want to bring it up again. Also, if they do want to discuss it, maybe they've made a goal that within the next 3 months, they're going to maybe have a consultation with a nutritionist. And that is something you're going to document in your notes, but then be like, okay, you've made this goal. We're going to reach out to a nutritionist to maybe have a consultation. Is that okay if I ask you in 3 months about the consultation and see how it went? And again, it just gives that patient the perception that you really care and you want to follow up on it. It's something important to you as their provider, and it's something that you want to track with them and work with them. It's not a one-off. It's not, hey, I think you should talk to your doctor about weight management. Check it off the list. Conversation ends. And so, again, I love motivational interviewing for that reason, because it's so patient-centered and it builds trust. And keeping the topic on the table is one of those tactics. So finally, we're going to discuss some clinical takeaways. And these are just some things that maybe you can think about, put it on your to-do list in the next couple weeks as you talk about this with your team or with your office. The first is training and education. If your office or your group of people that you're working with do not have experience and don't feel comfortable, the best way that you can do to learn this is just practice. Practice on each other. Watch a couple motivational interviewing videos online. There's a ton of them. And make it a point at maybe a staff meeting or something, but just practice on each other. Role play. Like if maybe one of you takes turns being the patient and you just practice and come up with some good icebreakers or good openers to discuss weight management. Practicing is great. Another thing you can do is take a workshop together. Take a workshop in patient communication together and then do a debrief and maybe revisit it once a month. You have a communication tips meeting. I don't know. I'm just sort of brainstorming here, but training and education is so important. I think practice makes perfect. And if you don't practice it, you're not going to use it. That's just proven time and time again. And I think that practicing patient communication is really beneficial. You can even practice on patients, right? Every time we see a patient, we're practicing something, and maybe try it out on patients that you really trust and you have a good relationship with. And seek feedback. Ask patients for feedback at the end of your visit. Did you feel supported? What are some techniques or ways that I can support you in the future? And I think that gives you really good constructive criticism. It depends on how you ask the question, right? We don't want defeating feedback. But if you ask for really good feedback in what are some techniques, how can I improve in this? Or what are some techniques that you enjoyed when I was giving you patient care? And I think you'll find some of the things that you do really well are well received. Next is integrated care models. This kind of goes back to the last tip I had, but as an office in your clinic or your practice, having integrated practitioners that you develop a relationship with is really important. And then that goes back to it gives the patients the perception that you constantly are working with others. Patients really like that. They want to know that it's safe to sort of seek out other providers. And if you have that rapport already, it's way easier to refer patients on, right? So as an office, if you have incorporated dietitians, local primary care providers, nurses, people that have worked with you in the past, that goes a long way developing relationships that patients can use. That benefits you as a practitioner, but it also benefits your patients because then they have, and this is a selling point, they have this big network of providers that you collaborate with at their disposal, right? So that's another sort of clinical takeaway. And then again, finally, is patient-centered care. We want to always make sure that the patient is in the center of the conversation. Their comfort and willingness to engage are the most important aspects of behavior change. Because if they don't feel comfortable and they're not engaged in the decision, you can preach to them all you want. You can talk about weight management all you want. But if you do not have rapport and engagement with your patient, it is going to fall flat. And so the relationship comes first. You building the relationship with the patient, you building rapport, building trust, and getting engagement is going to be paramount when it comes to helping patients with anything. This goes beyond weight management, but I'm bringing it up specifically in weight management context because that's what we're talking about today. But it is true for anything. Rapport, trust, and engagement are the three biggest aspects when it comes to patient behavior change and patient engagement. So I hoped that helped. I hope the birds weren't too distracting. And I just want to thank you for listening. If you're still on, I appreciate it. I appreciate the support. And we will see you back next Friday with a new episode. See you then.